Fire the brain to work for us. Nice. All right. So, just a bit of an introduction for myself. I know Susanna gave a lovely introduction, but just a bit more in depth of who I am. My name, of course, is Kashaya Stewart. I am a business psychologist and a neuroscience researcher. I work with a company within the UK called Zircon Management Consultancy Limited. We currently do a lot of work within project management. That's what I do, project management. I do research. And of course, we have our own suite of tools. We have tools like resilience. We have psychometric tools like psychological safety, decision styles, all those types of things. So we're really interested in kind of making sure that we are adaptable for talent management moving forward and making sure companies are able to grow and change and manage risks. And so, also, my academic background, for a bit of information on that, I do have a Master's of Science in Neuroscience from King's College London. I also have a Master's in Occupational and Business Psychology, a Bachelor's in Psychology. I also worked as an assistant for a behavioral science lab and also worked in the neurophysiology unit at the Eric Williams Medical Science Complex. So I do have a good bit of background about neuroscience, a good idea of what kind of goes on within the brain, and I'm very happy to kind of come in and share this knowledge with you guys tonight. So, kind of before I go on to my first slide, I just wanted to have you guys think for a minute and kind of think about what you know about resilience. And if you can in the chat, start thinking about and putting down your ideas of what resilience is not. Just a bit of housekeeping. We will probably go through a lot of these things, a lot of the Q&As at the end of the process, at the end of all my slides, because there's quite a bit of knowledge on there. So if you can kind of put your questions into the chat, put your answers in the chat, and then we'll kind of come back and reconvene in the Q&A at the end. So you can pop in what you kind of think now of what resilience is not. Before we go into my next slide, which gives you kind of the answer, and we'll kind of go back afterwards to see what you guys thought resilience is not. But from my point of view, resilience is not toughing it out. It's not toughing it out to the detriment of yourself. You know, a lot of times we have this kind of saying that, the Lord gives its toughest battles to those who could bear it. You need pressure to be able to create these diamonds. But honestly, too much pressure could literally lead us to a very dangerous place. It could lead to things like heart attacks, it could lead to things like strokes and so on. So, resilience is not about making our lives miserable and suffering through adversities all the time and just waiting for the next unfortunate event to occur. And resilience is really not about suppressing your emotions. A lot of times people say you just power through, just power through it, you'll make it to the end. And it's not really about also becoming like a robot who never breaks down, where you're not actually feeling your feelings anymore. You're just pretending that everything is fine. That's not actually resilience. That's when things backfire. And I could give a quick example of this from my university days, especially when I did my bachelor's in psychology. I had a very toxic relationship when it came to assignments. So what kept happening is every time I had an assignment due, I would start to panic, I would start to stress, and then I would call in my parents, telling them I don't know what to do. This assignment is coming up. I'm feeling stressed. I'm crying. I'm feeling to throw up in that moment. And that will happen every time I had an assignment due. But the thing is, I would go through that experience. I would do the assignment, do the essay, get my marks back, pass, and then do that cycle again. So in my brain, I was thinking, okay, I'm being resilient. I'm toughing out to it. Everybody must be going through this experience. But honestly, that's not something that's sustainable, and that's not something that is actually resilient. So then that now poses the question to us, then what is actually resilience then? So you may have heard about resilience before, but for me, resilience is really about being able to bounce forward, not just about bouncing back. Just checking that you guys could still see me. I think.
Yes, yes, we can.
Okay. Okay, lovely. Because I think it came off for a second. Lovely. Right. So I'm thinking resilience to me is about really bouncing forward, not just to bounce back, you know? It's not just about getting over it. It's really about adapting in the face of difficulties and recovering in a way that makes you stronger, you know? True resilience actually involves emotional awareness, it involves connection, flexibility, and regulations. If you think about a rubber band, you could, pull the rubber band, it could bounce back. But what you really want in that level is you want that growth within you. If I look back to my university example, the point I raised, when you now come to now do your masters, it's a different level of work that needs to be done. And that kind of process that I was doing could no longer fly anymore. So then I had to now learn a new way, a more resilient way of doing my assignments. Because now when you go in the workplace and you have work to now hand up, you can't be, feeling sick, feeling to throw up every time you have something due. And especially for people like entrepreneurs, or if you own your own business, this matters. As you know, every single day deals fall through, plans shift, you have stakeholders that come in and they want to redo the whole project, and so the resilience is really about going through maybe some adverse, you know going through those adverse experiences, but really reflecting and growing from it. And resilience is also about knowing that you have that ability to build it, because it's not really something that you're born with or that you're born without. It's actually a skill set. A lot of people see resilience almost like a muscle, so you have to like really train this resilience muscle to do what it needs to do. So it's actually something that we do have the potential to develop. And so if we go into now the key areas of the brain that's involved in resilience, because I know that's what a lot of people are very excited to learn about, is this kind of brain area. So I would like to introduce you to this resilience dream team. That's what I like to call it. And there's actually four members of this dream team, but we'll go on to the fourth member when we get onto the other slide. But I really liked this image because I felt that it was very simplistic, and it really was able to highlight to you guys the three parts of the brain in a very clear and concise way. So let's start looking at how your brain handles stress when things are working well in your mental resilience dream team, right? So because these regions here that are on the screen, they actually help you stay grounded, they help you adapt to challenges, and they help you recover quickly. And each one has a unique role, and together they do form a powerful system of resilience. So first up, we have the amygdala on the screen. That's a little red area on the screen, and that's a tiny almond-shaped structure. And that think about the amygdala as if it's like your internal alarm system. It's always on. It's always scanning for danger, even before consciously you know that something is wrong. So when you detect a threat, it actually alerts your hypothalamus, which is another part of the brain within there, which flips the switch on your sympathetic nervous system. And that system is where you see your fight, your flight, or your freeze response. That's your sympathetic nervous system there. So it's very fast, it's very active, and it's very essential for survival, right? But when you're dealing with something like stress in your workplace, you might not need to be fighting a bear. You might not need to be, running out of the office. So you could see how the amygdala may cause some issues there when it comes to chronic stress, but we'll come to that later on. And the next part of the brain I would like to introduce you to is the prefrontal cortex. So the prefrontal cortex is like the leader of the team. Think about it as like the boss. That's the rational part of your brain. That's where you have a lot of problem solving, where you have a lot of high level thinking, a lot of critical analysis. And it really helps us evaluate whether the alarms are real emergencies or they might just be false ones. It's also a part of the brain that regulates emotions. So it helps you focus, it helps you make decisions, and it also overrides some of the impulsive reactions that may come up. So really think about it as if it's like the team captain. It's keeping everybody in the brain there in check. And so, but here's the catch: under stress, that prefrontal cortex does become less active. But we will once again come to that later on. And then we have the hippocampus. So think about the hippocampus as like the historian, like the brain of the brain of the brain, but in terms of the memory bank of the brain. You know, it helps you interpret what's happening based on past experiences. So you could really think about, have I faced this before? What worked? What didn't? You know, this context is very important because what it does is it really stops us from overreacting to every stressful event as if it's something new. So it really pulls on that memory of, oh, have I seen this before? Have I been in this situation before? What did I do then? And it's also essential for learning and also emotional memory. So now remember, I told you guys there was a fourth member of the team, and that fourth member of the team is the insula. So this is a lesser known area. Some of the other areas are very, prominent. They come up quite frequently if you know much about neuroscience. And that area actually connects your physical sensations with your emotional awareness. So what does that mean? So it helps you notice when your heart is racing. Sometimes your heartbeat racing, or you're feeling like your stomach hurting, or your muscles tightening, and sometimes you don't actually know what's causing you to feel that way. So when that's happening, the insula lights up, and it helps link those sensations to what you're actually feeling emotionally. And this kind of mind body based awareness, it is often the first sign that you're stressed. So you typically get this coming up. Your insula tells you, you have this bodily reaction, and then the insula now gives you the ability to step in early before the stress could actually take over completely. So when that amygdala, the prefrontal cortex, the hippocampus, and the insula, when they're communicating well, even in the process of stress, you don't just react, you respond. So you could actually stay connected, you could stay emotionally aware, and you're able to have that bounce back and bounce forward, what is what we want when it comes to resilience, right? But what happens when the brain is in constant stress, that chronic stress, right? So we knew from what we saw before that the prefrontal cortex, when you're not, too stressed, you're just having a bit of stress, but your resilience system is actually working as it should. It has very tight control, tight reins. The team leader is doing as it should. It's making sure that everything stays in control and it stays in order. But when you are feeling that the really high level of stress, the amygdala actually takes over. And like that system, remember we said that's like your alarm system. This is where things really start breaking down because it's almost like a car stuck in overdrive, right? Your system now becomes something that's constantly on edge. And now, as we could see, you now become stuck. You become stuck within your own brain because the amygdala becomes hyperactive. It becomes more sensitive to anything that may be a threat. So that could be even small things. And the thing about, remember, we said the amygdala was a small almond size shape in the brain, it could actually grow. When you're in that state of hyperreactivity, the amygdala grows in size. So that means now you may have more false alarms, more anxiety, more emotional reactivity. Meanwhile, your prefrontal cortex actually weakens because what the amygdala is doing is pulling resources away from the rest of the brain. So now your prefrontal cortex can't do as it should, and you start losing your ability to regulate. You start losing your ability to think clearly or make balanced decisions. And then remember, I said the amygdala is taking resources, is also taking resources from your hippocampus as well. And it starts to shrink. And chronic cortisol levels, that's the body's main stress hormone, actually starts damaging the hippocampal cells. And that makes it much harder for us to form memories or to stay calm after stress. And then what happens to the insula? The insula then also goes out of order. If you think about it, it now becomes fully overwhelmed by sensations. So what tends to happen is people, you can see people going into a very sensitive state where you're now hyperactive. Everything just makes you feel jumpy. You're feeling, all sorts, or you can feel extremely numb. You get very low lows. And that can make you feel very disconnected from your body because you feel overly reactive or even anxious without knowing why that's happened. And then when that stress becomes chronic, that alarm system that keeps going off, your amygdala, and that goes off when there's no real threat. And what happens is that you now end up in a loop. You end up in a loop of overthinking. You end up in that space of procrastination, and you end up in that state of burnout. And this is really how you end up getting stuck, because the survival brain starts taking over, your thinking brain starts shutting down, and now you've gone down the spiral, right? And if we really think about how much that takes, it sounds extremely taxing on the body, because it is, because that sympathetic system, that sympathetic nervous system, your fight, flight, or freeze, is now always in high gear. Your heart is racing, your breathing gets shallow, your muscles is now staying tense, and now being in this state of fight or flight all the time burns a lot of energy, and it keeps you on edge. So over time, it leads to this like fatigue, it leads to sleeping problems, irritability, and even physical illness. And this type of chronic illness is really, it's not a joking matter in that sense, because it becomes extremely dangerous. You're in that high level of stress, your higher heart rate is up. So of course it's leading to things like heart attacks, is leading to things like heart disease, is leading to things like hypertension and stroke. And it could also contribute to the development of, type 2 diabetes by impacting your blood sugar regulation. Um, I know you guys will learn a bit more about that in the next talk that's coming up, but it's really important to mention some of these things here, because some people don't think about, what's going on in the brain and how that actually leads to some things that happen, physical things that happen within the body. And leading on from that, you also get this chronically high cortisol. And cortisol is the stress hormone. I'm not sure if you guys have ever heard about it, but it really also dampens your immunity, your immune system, and it shrinks structures in the brain. Things like your serotonin and your dopamine, those are like your happy hormones. Those things deplete. So now you start feeling depressed, you start feeling low, you start now having difficulty enjoying life. And then we have also GABA, which is another hormone. That's your brain's natural calming chemicals, and that also gets suppressed. So now it's hard to even feel relaxed. And then you have oxytocin, which is another hormone that's about connection and trust. That goes down, which makes you feel more isolated and more disconnected from others, you know? And so then what goes on when that goes on, that chronic stress goes on for too long, when that alarm bell doesn't be able, isn't able to stop. At some point your brain does start adapting, but it starts adapting really not to help you, but it's not to help you thrive really, but to help you survive in what it's really perceiving as an extremely dangerous and extremely uncomfortable world. Right? I just wanted to pause for a quick second just to see if we had any specific questions coming up yet about those things. Okay, no
No
questions.
questions
Okay,
in the chat, but for
okay,
persons who
perfect.
just joined, feel free to put your questions in the chat. We do have
Mhm.
that feature to the end if you have more questions. But at this time, by show of hands or any images, anybody has any questions before Kashaya goes on? Nope. Go ahead, Kashaya.
Okay, perfect. Lovely. All right, so going on to the next part. So, of course, as we just kind of said, in terms of the brain, your brain now starts working against you because it's thinking that it needs to adapt to survive in that now dangerous world, right? And now your brain, it starts not being on your side because your brain loves patterns. It loves things like predictability. It loves things like a shortcut. And there's a very valid reason why, because your brain is processing so much information. It's actually estimated that your brain is processing around 11 million bits per second through your senses. So that's just unconscious information that your brain has to be filtering out. However, your conscious mind now could only handle about a fraction of that. So that's about, think like 40 to 50 bits per second. That's what your conscious mind is actually, being able to handle, to process. But it uses now these past experiences to now predict the future. So if you think about it, you start doing things automatically. You ever see some people drive and they're driving automatically, or you wake up, you brush your teeth, you're not even thinking about it. That's your brain taking shortcuts because it has better, well, not better things to think about, but it has a lot of important things to think about. So it must now create shortcuts that you could use. And that's very efficient, but it's not always accurate especially when it comes to things like stress and things like that. Because when stress is constant and unpredictable, what the brain starts doing, it begins to lose its sense of agency, and it starts like losing that belief that your actions actually make a difference. So every time that prefrontal cortex now tries to regulate, it gets overridden by that hyperactive amygdala that we talked about before. And then every time you try to cope, but nothing seems to help, your brain now gets this message that I'm no longer in control. It doesn't matter what I do. And that's the seed that really sows and creates this beast of learned helplessness. And so this concept was really first studied in animals. It's a psychological concept of learned helplessness, and it's not a very ethical way of studying, and people don't do these tests anymore. But what they used to do is that they had animals under repeated exposure of uncomfortable stress, and that caused them to stop trying to escape. So they would put this animal in maybe like a cage, and then they'll have them be very stressed out, and then they wouldn't let them escape. And then over time, even when they open the door and they leave, like the door open, the animal no longer tries to escape, even if it's possible. And we see a similar thing happening in humans. So when people face these kind of repeated setbacks, they feel like they aren't in control and they stop trying, even if the situation later changes. Your brain actually starts to believe that the things you do don't matter anymore. And I was thinking about a good example of this, and I had the thought of like a puzzle analogy. Because say, for example, looking at the wheel, you had this adverse experience of losing your job, right? You unexpectedly lost your job and now you're back on the job market, and they put you to do this assessment. And the assessment looks like making a puzzle. And they put you in a room, they say, we're going to give you 10 minutes, and they ask you to build this puzzle. You don't have the picture of the puzzle, they just give you the puzzle pieces and they say, try your best to make a puzzle. The best, if you build the puzzle, you move on to the next stage and you get the puzzle. Somebody who's actually feeling resilient, someone who's, has their resilient mind and resilient brain on, they may now start looking at the puzzle. They're thinking of past experiences. They're telling themselves, okay, what could I do? Could I start looking at the end pieces of a puzzle, start putting, colors together, start thinking what could be, maybe this is the ocean, maybe this is sand, maybe this is the sky. They're really trying to, use their brain, use their hippocampus, use the prefrontal cortex to come up with something. But if you're now in a state of this learned helplessness, you're in a state of chronic stress, as we spoke about, then when you get that puzzle, it could really trigger a reaction in your mind of, why am I doing this? Why are you putting me to do this? This doesn't actually matter. What is the point of this? And then that stops your brain from even trying. You don't try to even do the puzzle, you don't try to build anything. And then when the time is up, the 10 minutes up, and they say, sorry, didn't move on to the next stage because you didn't try to build this puzzle, then that validates your belief of, you see, this didn't even matter in the first place. I didn't even try. And then you go home and you start being like, why I didn't even try? I didn't even give myself a fighting chance. So now you're blaming yourself and you're feeling, hopeless. And that cycle just continues on and on and on. And this is very common. We see this a lot in burnout, and we see this a lot in like business setbacks, where like people get into this learned helplessness loop over time. And if we really think about it from what we started off with, looking at the brain, that chronic stress really shrinks the brain's capacity to respond effectively. And this now then creates more of a feeling of failure or defeat, which then leads on to more stress, which further damages the brain's resilience. So it really becomes a self reinforcing cycle. It really becomes a cycle of learned helplessness. And the problem is with that is that the longer it goes on, the harder it is to break. And one thing that comes to mind why it's a lot harder to break as well is this idea of schemas. So when you find yourself in some of these pits of helplessness, all of a sudden there's some really toxic thoughts that starts bubbling up. You feel like, some thoughts from way, way, way back from your childhood that all of a sudden starts bubbling up. That's actually schemas coming into play. And it's a core mental framework that your brain actually uses to interpret the world. So to give you a bit more of a breakdown, think about schemas as almost like your a deep rooted belief, deep rooted template that you kind of formed earlier in life. And this is often from kind of repeated emotional experiences. So they really tend to help us answer questions like, who am I? Am I safe? Can I actually trust people? Do I matter? All these things we tend to build these kind of frameworks around in our early experiences. But the problem is that sometimes these schemas could also be shaped by trauma, could be shaped by rejection, neglect, or ongoing stress. So your brain could actually form maladaptive schemas in your belief system that kind of keeps you stuck and keeps you in that state of learned helplessness. And I can kind of give you an example about this because I know this topic can be a bit not like difficult to grasp sometimes. So let's say you had a primary school experience where you had a teacher that may have constantly told you that you will never amount to anything. You would never amount to anything. I don't see you going anywhere. Get out of my class. That could happen. We've all seen teachers get upset sometimes and say some things, but when you're that young, sometimes just a simple thing like that could really build a schema in your mind. And the problem with this is that these beliefs tend to become almost automatic filters in which we view a lot of situations, even the ones that don't actually feel like they fit. And the thing about the brain is, the problem is like your brain doesn't challenge the schema, it just keeps trying to confirm it. So, for example, if you just had, think about that, you will never amount to anything, and you have a glass, you're already feeling low on resilience, and you fill a glass with water and you accidentally spill the glass, and the glass falls to the floor, and the first thing that comes to your mind is, you see, I would never amount to anything. I can't even hold a glass properly. How am I supposed to make sure business is thriving? How am I supposed to make sure, like, how am I going to get this business to exceed? I can't even hold a glass properly, right? That's a schema in action. So even when your circumstances improve, or even when you're doing better, or you have achieved great things, you may not actually feel it. And that's how the schema kind of keeps you in that hopelessness loop, because you don't try, because you don't believe that you amount to anything. So you could end up missing opportunities because you're scanning for proofs of failure, and every disappointment no matter how small, reinforces that belief in your mind, and makes you feel like giving up, right? This is just to show you guys how deep this kind of brain, that helplessness, that chronic stress goes, how deep it goes within your mind. Because people might think, oh, I'm just stressed, but it really goes quite deep and it really does affect a lot of what's going on in your brain. And one other thing that comes up and that came to mind for me was the fact that a lot of times that feeling, that schema of, like, for example, you would never amount to anything, it feels so real. And it feels in those moments like it feels so very real, even if when it's not accurate. And that's where the brain's emotional memory system comes in. Because the brain doesn't just remember that event where the teacher may have told you something like that, but it remembers how you felt. And surprise, surprise, that emotional memory is stored in the amygdala, not, the logical time aware part of the brain like the hippocampus, but it's already in the amygdala where it might be growing, where you're in this constant state of stress. And now you have this emotional memory system that's being triggered all the time. So when something in your present feels even slightly familiar, for example, say you get reprimanded by a boss or business deals fall through, your amygdala can become reactive. The emotions of the past, even the actual, even though the situation is completely different. So, you might be safe now, but your brain is pulling up that feeling of fear that you experienced. And because the emotional memory system works faster than your logical brain, it feels as if it feels true. It feels so true, even if it's not. And over time, this disconnect between that emotional memory and the actual reality can make it hard for you to even trust your own instincts, because your emotions now start to betray you. You feel like if you're just kind of living in the past, you feel like you're stuck in being that child in that room that's being reprimanded, even when you're excelling in things that you want to do in the future. And here's where it gets even more painful, because the brain could start lying to you, the same brain that we're saying should be protecting you, it could now turn inwards of itself and really start criticizing yourselves and your thoughts. And you get some of these passing thoughts, and they could be automatic, other times they're intrusive. And as we said before, it feels very true, but they're not facts. They're kind of voices of trauma, their voices of stress, their voices of survival. And it almost, think about it in a way of like a mental echo. It's a mental echo of pain inside your brain that never really got to be processed. It never got to be released. So it's just bouncing around. That pain is just bouncing around in your brain, and it's coming back up in these circumstances of stress. And the real tragedy of it all is that when you believe these thoughts, you act in a way that kind of confirms it, that self-fulfilling prophecy. So you stop trying, that learned helplessness. You start isolating and you start shrinking to fit a life that's really much smaller than what you are truly actually capable of doing. And you might be saying, no, Kshaya, that sounds very grim. That sounds very, not very uplifting. And you might be asking yourself, well, why did I tell you all of this? Why did I go through kind of all this brain and, the brain betrays you and this learned helplessness? Why did I go so much in depth into that part? Well, the truth is that the more you understand what's happening in your brain, is the more power that you actually have to change it. Because when you name what's happening, that's my, you start saying, that's my amygdala acting up today. I could feel my insula lighting up. You actually can start creating space between the feeling and the reaction. So, and that space is really where the choices live. Because when you can label a feeling, you can label a thought, you can label a body sensation, that's where your prefrontal cortex actually starts activating. It reactivates in that moment of stress. And that helps you regulate your emotional response. So that means that simply understanding, simply naming what you're going through can lower stress, it can restore balance, and it could make you feel more controlled. And I told you all of this, all of that background, because that's truly where the birthplace of resilience is. That's how you actually become more resilient. And this is a turning point. We went from all this learned helplessness to now, how can you now rewire your brain for resilience? And the great thing that we have in
Shaya,
our brain, oh, yeah,
Shaya,
sorry.
just an interjection here. Just some
Mm-hmm,
two comments that I know it's going to feed into what you're about to present. I know we're
yeah.
doing good for time. So
Mm-hmm.
I had put in the chat, to everyone, any of this sounds like you, anything that sounds familiar. We do have yes at times, but we do have a comment that I thought this might help. Um,
Mm-hmm.
there, there are areas I can relate to. So that belief system in the brain of self-sabotage,
Yes.
as would have said, I will try to replace those with positive self-talk when I do.
Hmm.
Yeah. So that's some incoming comments that could help you propel as we go to the other aspect of the rewiring for your resilience.
Yes, definitely. We have another comment about not seeing me on the screen. Susanna, can you see me on the screen?
I am seeing your name, but I'm also seeing your slide. So
Okay.
for
Would it be
everyone, if you're seeing, I'm seeing your slides, which is more importantly that we're seeing the content.
okay? Would you like me to just quickly refresh, or should I just keep going as we go
Uh,
into the next section?
oh, she's seeing the slide. Kadisha, you're seeing the slide though? Because I know you said you're not seeing Kashaya, because as she's presenting, you won't. But are you seeing the content and the
Yeah,
slide?
I'm seeing the
Okay.
slide and just the name. I just wasn't seeing her video.
Oh,
It
okay.
started off with her video and then something happened and I was like, oh, okay. But the content is good, so I'm invested. Keep going.
Perfect. Keep going, Kashaya. We're at 7:11, guys. I know it's at 7:30. We want to make sure we respect person's time, but at the same time, just give us a quick thumbs up. How is she going? Is the information helping support some of the aha moments? Yes.
Nice.
Nice.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Perfect. Right. So let's go a bit more now into this turning point of, how can your brain be rewired now for resilience? And we have this really great thing in our brain. It's called neuroplasticity. I'm not sure if you guys have ever heard of it, but this neuroplasticity it's actually quite an exciting concept in neuroscience. A lot of people enjoy this aspect of neuroplasticity because your brain does this wonderful thing. It has this built-in ability to change, this ability to adapt, and this ability to rewire itself based on experiences. So before we spoke about how it could kind of rewire itself in not the best way, but this means that your brain is not fixed. It's not constant. It's constantly learning, it's constantly growing, and it's constantly reshaping even when we get into old age. So for a long time, people believe the saying, you can't teach an old dog new tricks. Or, you will hear people saying, I born so, I so since I small, don't try and change me, I born so. And those sayings really came from the idea of the brain becoming static. So a lot of people thought that your brain was growing and growing and growing. You reach an age, say like 25 to 30, and then your brain kind of stayed the same, and then you started going downhill, started declining after that. But now we know the truth that your brain really has the power to change for life. It could form new connections, it could grow new neurons, it could shift your sense of identity. You could override some of these old connections that we have made before. And so this new neural pathways that we see leads to this new behavior that we want. And I like this quote. It's from Dr. Joe Dispenza. It says, lose your mind and create a new one. I like this quote. I know the lose your mind could be a bit, iffy to say, but I do like that, in those feelings of helplessness, in those feelings of really low resilience, you can feel a lot like if you're losing your mind, and having that reminder of neuroplasticity, having that reminder that you can create almost a new brain on a whole, makes you feel powerful in that way, that you know that just one choice, one practice, one new idea can really change the way your life is moving forward. So let's go into some of the hacks now, because this is the fun part. And I really like going through this because it's almost like you could build your own resilience toolkit. Because remember, resilience will look very different for every person. Every person has gone through different experiences. So a lot of these things will look very different for everyone. But these are some hacks here for you. So the first one we have is deep breathing, because deep breathing signals to your nervous system to relax. It really shifts you from that fight or flight, that sympathetic mode that we talked about earlier, to more of a rest and digest, and that's your parasympathetic mode. So in just about a minute, just by deep breathing, your amygdala actually starts to calm down, and your prefrontal cortex gets the chance to take the wheel again, just by doing some breathing exercises. And there's one breathing exercise where it's like, well, there's two of them that are very popular. There's one, the 4-4s method, where it's 4, you inhale for 4, you hold for 4, you exhale for 4, and then you hold for 4 again. And then the really popular one is 2 inhales and 1 exhale. And that one would seem very familiar to a few, because it's the whew, that we typically hear when people, are panicking, or when it comes to delivering babies. We tell mothers to go, and in that moment, what we're really trying to do is get that nervous system to try and relax, even in that moment. So that's where that breathing exercise comes in. And another tip we have here, another hack, is to move your body. Physical exercise does indeed boost the brain's chemicals like dopamine and serotonin. And as we said earlier, that's nature's natural mood lifters. And although this could be very hard to do, especially if you work a day job, especially if you're by the laptop all the time, but movement also reduces that buildup of stress hormones like the cortisol that we talked about earlier. And it really does help rewire your brain to adapt and become more flexible. Even just 10 minutes can help boost clarity and have you being very calm, to help calm you down. And the other one we have here is journaling, writing things down. Writing things down does actually activate the prefrontal cortex, because you're really able to now make sense of your feelings. Sometimes that your head could feel fuzzy, could feel like you have a bunch of noise in your head. But really journaling and doing prompts like, what am I actually feeling in this moment? What am I actually feeling now? That helps override some of those feelings. And then some other hacks that we have here, talk it out. The social connection. A lot of times people think social media is terrible, but a lot of times actually being social, talking to someone we trust, venting about what we're going through, actually helps lower stress. It helps regulate emotions, and it helps activate the insula and strengthen that kind of social safety circuit. And that actually helps protect the brain against things like that stress and anxiety that we may be feeling. Another hack that there is to pause, and pause before reacting, because when you trigger your amygdala, it acts fast, it acts very fast. But that wiser prefrontal cortex needs a second to catch up. So by just pausing for a second before you respond, before you do something, it really gives a tiny space. And that tiny space, as we said before, is kind of where that power is, of stopping yourself and really thinking about what's going on. And then celebrating small wins. As we've seen before, the brain tends to have a bit of a negativity bias. It remembers the bad day. We know it remembers that bad day, the bad comments, the bad things people say way more easily than the good days. But when we really start consistently celebrating our small wins, I answered that tough email. I actually got up and I spoke in front of the crowd, even though I was terrified. You activate dopamine and you reinforce a more hopeful mindset. And these small victories actually really start stacking up. And sleep. sleep is so very important for just maintenance. You will hear from doctors all the time that sleep is so important. And it's so important because it helps balance emotions. It helps, get rid of, people say it's like, yes, like it's like cleaning the brain out, cleaning the house of the brain. And the thing about it is chronic sleep loss actually disrupts the resilience team's communication. So you don't, when you're in chronic stress, the system already breaks down. So you don't want the system to already be disrupted and then it starts breaking down because now you're in a full loop of very in dangerous territory at that point. And then the next hack that we have is that mindfulness and meditation. And mindfulness isn't really about, stopping thoughts, but it's about noticing them. Just kind of like that journaling. It's really about tapping in and being able to strengthen that prefrontal cortex and quiet the amygdala down and increase the level of activity in the insula. So you really want to start building that mind body connection to help boost your ability to stay grounded during stress. And then the last one we have here is this cognitive reframing. And that's it is a superpower for resilience because it doesn't mean ignoring the pain, it doesn't mean ignoring when bad things happen, but it means really looking at it from a different angle. It means challenging what we know and what we could learn at that moment. So you could really see failure as maybe a time of courage, or you could start seeing things from a different angle. What did I actually learn from that failure? Maybe you went into a business call, a business meeting, didn't go as planned, you didn't get a deal, but what did you actually learn? Did they actually give you a piece of wisdom that you could use moving forward? And that reframing actually also strengthens the prefrontal cortex and it creates new neural pathways, which is amazing for optimism. So, from this, I hope you all got the gist of what's going on in the brain when it comes to resilience. And you don't need to be a neuroscientist to really change your brain. You just need that awareness. You just need to be able to put a name to that feeling. And then having these few small secret resilience weapons in your toolkit, having that consistency because you can't really control everything that happens to you. Life is extremely turbulent. The natural disasters happen. Things go wrong all the time. So, you can understand, it's really about understanding how the brain responds and also being able to train it to respond differently from what it might automatically try to do. And that's what resilience actually really is about. It's not really about being unshaken, but it's being aware, it's being adaptive, and it's also being deeply kind to yourself and giving yourself space and understanding what's happening to your brain, to your mind, to your body as you move through life, as you kind of, are trying to hold on to these rails and fight through the storm ahead. So, yeah, that was kind of my whole presentation about resilience. So I just want to thank everyone for listening. And are there any questions? Is there anyone who who had anything that they wanted to ask?
So I have no questions in the chat, but you could always
Mhm.
mic up. I do have to a comment. Moving your body has really helped me as an entrepreneur. Okay. Also, with a regular day job, burnout was sadly my best friend. Okay. Going,
Mhm.
going to the gym helped you a lot, and at least 3 days a week. So that's fantastic. And I mean, you tell us what does burnout look like, especially as an entrepreneur? I'm curious.
Mhm.
Oh my God,
That
I
was
can't answer.
yes,
What burnout look like for me?
yes.
I think it was not really depression, but never really being almost in a robotic state. So not really being fully aware of what happening, what I'm doing, just doing things and then knocking out afterwards or having poor sleeping and eating habits because I'm trying to find different things to increase my mood, just always being extra irritable. Um people talking to me and zoning out because I was so exhausted. Especially the zoning out part was really bad. I felt so terrible at so many different times having that happen, but it was like there was no more capacity to take in anything, and then not being able to show up, not even just in the job, but like in friendships or in anything like that. So yeah, burnout was bad. But after a while and realizing that that was the problem, and then trying to I also, it resulted in high stress levels, then becoming, like, for example, pre-diabetic, ending up by the doctor with chronic pain. I had chronic neck pain, head pain for so many different days and not realizing what was happening. And the doctor was like, this is stress. And they suggested things like, movement. Or one doctor even said, well, why don't you light a candle and bathe in the dark and let that be an opportunity for you to switch off and almost create like a spa like moment in your home or something. But yeah, it was a lot. But movement helped, and also like Kasha mentioned, putting a name to it and identifying that this is what was happening, and identifying that this is maybe how I need to move forward afterwards.
Thank you. Thank you. And I want to mention, to add to that, that, we are giving you the opportunity of knowing what is causing certain triggers, but hopefully, we are giving you this e-journal. So in the chat, it's twofold things happening right now. I have just put up a poll so you can tell us how the feedback has been for this webinar. And two, in the chat has the e-journal, so you can really start your journey in terms of what we can do to help to better support that resilience mind that you do have. Remember, it's to create one, coming from the existing to a new one. So we have another one too. Kasha, I don't know if you saw the chat or we have a question. Good evening. Can drugs destroy certain parts of the brain on certain behaviors?
On certain behaviors. So what do you mean by certain behaviors? Do you mean in terms of stress, in terms of the hippocampus? Because drugs can, of course, cause what we call neural death. So, like, brain cells can be killed from taking in certain neurotoxins, certain types of drugs that can do that. Drugs can also shrink certain brain areas. So, in terms of, especially if we think about things like alcohol, we think about things like opioids or different kind of stimuli, those type of things can cause brain atrophy. So that's what we call like the shrinking parts of the brain. And that could actually happen to parts of the brain like the hippocampus, like the prefrontal cortex, like the cerebellum. So drugs can destroy certain parts of the brain. And of course, now if you're finding brain atrophy in areas like the hippocampus and the prefrontal cortex, that now would definitely lead to some behavioral changes because now it wouldn't operate as it should. So, as we said kind of earlier in the slides, it's in charge of memory, the hippocampus in charge of memory, the prefrontal cortex in charge of that, high level thinking. So then if you're having atrophy in those places, then they're no longer functioning as they should. So then you may be even more susceptible to things like stress. You're more susceptible to all of these things because those parts of the areas aren't specifically, acting as they should. But of course, it all depends on what type, all these types of things go on in the brain. And the brain does try to fix itself in those. And it does also impact things like neuroplasticity as well. Your ability, if you're having cell death, then your ability to now build new, neural connections, having that neuroplasticity also becomes very difficult as well. Susanna, I could see your hand is up.
Yes. So because it just came to me, I'm seeing the majority are, females on this call, but where is there a link, if at all, for, I would say perimenopause, menopause, and the brain?
Menopause and the brain. So I did actually do some research before in terms of menopause and the brain. So a lot of times what we did see in some of the research, and I could see if I find that research again, I think I have a paper on that in terms of when you're in that perimenopause and menopausal state, you can actually become more susceptible to things like stress, you can become more susceptible to things like burnout because of the chemical reactions that are going on in the body and those different fluctuating levels of different levels. So you have like things like the cortisol or testosterone or adrenaline, your adrenal glands, all these things are moving and they're changing. So it can make you, and those kind of chemicals are what we tend to call more of the not negative chemicals, but those are the ones where you are feeling that kind of stress and anxiety, that cortisol level. That's where those chemicals start reacting, and then you could start now not feeling as much the serotonin, the dopamine, those types of things, your oxytocin. And that's why a lot of times your sleep, goes out of whack. You start feeling, a lot of people get like depression and anxiety around that time as well. So it does actually affect that kind of chemical balance, which does now lead into you now being more likely to experience stress and anxiety. So a lot of times that's why we say during that period of time to kind of give you those vitamins to try and keep those levels up as much as possible during that time. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm not seeing any other questions, but we do have similarly. Yes?
Hi, I'd like to make a contribution.
Mm-hmm.
In my experience, I think sometimes we overlook the part that spiritual can play, the relative play in helping us become more resilient. If I share some of the experiences which yesterday on the job or several jobs I've had, the experience not for the faint of heart at all. Most people will get stressed out or anxious hearing about it. So I'm surrounded by a lot of people who have the ability to cope through challenge situations, and they are highly regulated and become even more irrational over time. What I think helps as well, not spirituality, grounded self day regardless of religion, but being outdoors in nature. That's also a very important and often overlooked experience to help bring the balance.
Yep, definitely. I could definitely agree with that, especially when we look at spirituality and the brain. Spirituality is almost like it helps in terms of like I would like to say it encapsulates the brain, or it is like a protective layer of the brain. And so a lot of times when people do have this spirituality and they do pray, they do meditate, they give time for this deep periods of reflection, we do see where there's strengthening of parts of the brain, like the prefrontal cortex, even your other parts of the brain, like the anterior cingulate cortex. That's part of the brain that deals with like things like empathy and compassion, even your temporal lobe, which has to do with things like memory, things like that, spiritual experiences. The having that spirituality kind of helps you because, as we said in your resilience toolkit, something like spirituality could go in that toolkit to help ground you, help lower those levels of cortisol, and gives that a greater, like a boost to your parasympathetic nervous system that we talked about, that kind of relaxation, that rest. It helps boost it up. So definitely having that spirituality is almost like a booster to your resilience. It's something that does help it. And we have seen research where people who are deeply spiritual, because they have that connection of, feeling that they know that they can be resilient, that they feel like they have someone behind them backing them up, that connection with a higher power, then that actually helps you feel more resilient over time. So having that spirituality does indeed, from a neuroscience perspective, does help in terms of resilience. You're completely correct.
I also want to add that sometimes you observe yourself, you really become in tune with your experience and your behaviors, thoughts, and what makes you tick initially. And sometimes you have naturally self-soothing or naturally de-stressing activities or behavior And even if you reflect upon your life from childhood forward, the things that you would have done naturally or things you would have gravitated to naturally or the activities, you would find that those things serve of that purpose for that time of your life, but maybe it can also serve a purpose in the present. So, people's so behaviors might be to be on edge and not, I wouldn't say on edge, but to move around a lot, to just a lot then. And based on socialization, fidgeting might be looked upon as not being socially acceptable. But some people, when they engage in that behavior, it helps you regulate whatever tension or anxiety or stress or whatever they feel. So sometimes it's good to express yourself as actually, genuinely, authentically as you probably can in order to strike that balance too.
Yeah, definitely. Having those times of self-soothing, as you said, it's all about, how you can build your own resilience toolkit. And of course, as I said, that would look completely different to someone else. So if, as you said, like that fidgeting helps you feel like that fidgeting helps you self-soothe, then that's completely okay, I think, for you to do, especially if you're in moments of high stress, high anxiety, do the things that you feel that you've grown to know actually works for yourself. So yeah, I definitely agree with that, Gabrielle. Thank you. That's perfect.
Yeah. All right. Any other comments or questions at this time? I see another person said they use meditation to assist with resilience. That's really good.
Yes. Yeah. That mind-body connection, that insular getting activation there. Amazing.
Yes. Anyone else that we could close at this time? Again, in the chat, there is your e-journal. Thank you so much. There's also the upcoming events. We would certainly like to see you all on the upcoming event, which is on glaucoma. And that's going to be tied to diabetes and other areas that we will be speaking with our optometrists. So again, folks, Candice, is there anything you would like us to know about as a sneak preview? Because we certainly would like to have you guys back.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you, Kashaya, for delivering such an insightful lecture this afternoon. I personally really appreciate it, and it really hit home or resonated with me, right? And a spin-off from Kashaya's lecture, guys, stress releases hormones like cortisols. Remember, it could increase your blood sugar levels, your blood pressure, and chronic stress could also lead to insulin resistance. So in so doing, someone could develop diabetes, and diabetes can affect our eyes in more ways than one, but it could also increase the risk of getting glaucoma or developing glaucoma. So we'll chat a bit about that in the next couple of weeks, and I look forward to meeting everyone again. Thank you.
Right. Thanks so much, Candice. And again, thank you so much, Kashaya. In the comments, we are very much now more informed, and certainly, we understand that everyone has their journey, and we would like to thank you once again. And on behalf of Inspira and the team, we want to wish everybody a very safe and happy weekend. Kashaya, good morning, because we know it is Saturday morning for you.
No, Saturday.
All right. So looking forward to everyone. And again, have a safe weekend. And thank you so much for our new subscribers. This meeting is recorded, so there will also be the links that we can send on to persons. And stay tuned. Go to our website, which is www.inspiraLTE.com, and you can register for the upcoming webinars. They are all free. Tell a friend. Have a good evening, everyone, and good night.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you for having us here.
Most welcome.